Ari, I knew I was going to have to shake things up at the top of this week's Bracketology with Oregon beating Ohio State, but I was surprised as I got down into it that I didn't want to move more teams around. And you want to know who is gumming up the works here, who is making this very, very hard for me?
Who's that?
It is the Alabama Crimson Tide.
Oh, for sure.
Because they've got that win against Georgia. They lost to Vanderbilt, and they probably should have lost to South Carolina, but they didn't. And we are a fan of winning clunkers here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure exactly where to go with them.
I can't think of a 3-week block of games I've seen in any point covering the sport that's more confusing than Alabama's last 3 games.
It's incredible because they are still one of the most talented teams in the country. Jalen Milroe is one of the best quarterbacks. Ryan Williams is a dominant receiver, but I've gotten to where I'm not sure about their defense, and they just don't seem to have the same edge they had in the Nick Saban era. And really it goes back to the second half of the Georgia game. You know, they were up 28-0. You think this is the most dominant team I've ever seen in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And now I got them ahead of Georgia because they beat Georgia. I think next week, if Georgia goes and beats Texas in Austin, we can drop the pretense of the head-to-head. I love head-to-head, but in that case, it's going to be real hard to honor that here.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's interesting with this is that with Bracketology, with Bubble Watch, there is a mound of SEC teams that are either in the field or on the verge of being in the field. And trying to project which teams are going to win those games that are coming up that are going to impact who makes it as the 11-9. Like Texas A&M, for instance, I believe is in your field.
Exactly.
What do you do with Texas A&M, who's going to be hosting LSU in a few weeks, which is going to be a huge game for the playoff picture?
But that I left Texas A&M where they were, and I have LSU just on the outside looking in the first 4 out.
Yeah, but between Tennessee, LSU, Texas A&M, Georgia, Alabama, you have 5-6 teams in the SEC that are all vying for maybe 4 spots when it's all said and done?
I think it's 3 or 4, and it's probably 4.
So the question you have to ask yourself, and is one that we're all going to be asking, is what has to happen with Alabama for you to move them out in favor of a team like LSU or Tennessee? Does Alabama have to lose again, or if they keep winning these weird...
I have good news for you, Ari. They play LSU. So
that's true. No, I know, but I'm saying we are in a position where we don't know what Alabama is right now.
No, we don't.
Because if they won a national championship this year, that wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world. But if they lost 2 or 3 more games, that also would not be shocking. We're in this weird middle ground between what did that Georgia game mean, and the Vanderbilt game, I think, was telling because they didn't just fluke off a game. They lost to Vanderbilt.
I mean, Alabama goes to Knoxville this week.
Yeah.
And it kind of feels like the same thing as Ole Miss LSU. Remember, going into Ole Miss LSU this weekend, we said that feels like an elimination game because I can't imagine the loser winning out. I can't imagine the loser of this Alabama-Tennessee game winning out.
Yeah. And it's interesting because as the results from the other conferences come in, Andy, I think Alabama is going to be a thorn in everyone's side all year because, at the end of this, they're going to still have a win against Georgia.
Yeah.
And if they are a 2-loss team with the win against Georgia,
they're in.
Yeah. So from that standpoint, I don't think that it's a elimination game against Tennessee just on the surface. But when you make the point that you don't believe that they could win out from there, I think that makes sense.
Right.
Now, that said, Georgia's playing Texas on Saturday.
Yes.
Georgia's an underdog. The weight of the Georgia win potentially could not be as powerful.
Right. It drops if Texas beats Georgia. And then we also have to ask the question, if Georgia goes and loses to Texas, can they finish out? Now, I think they probably can, especially if it's close like the Alabama loss was. I don't look at Ole Miss, Georgia in the same way that I did at the beginning of the season. But it's another one where you're thinking, maybe we're just assuming too much. Maybe they're not going to be able to get out of this thing with less than 3 losses.
Yeah. So I think the thing that you had to do, I guess, in what you're doing, and which is different from polls, is projecting out how you think this is going to play out, and you put Georgia 9.
Yeah, I did, which says I think they're going to lose one more game.
And then you have Alabama
8.
It's crazy stuff, man.
Yeah, and that's the problem. I mean, and then you've got LSU, and I'm sure there's some LSU fans like, hey, why are you not putting us in? We lost to USC. That's not a great loss, but you have Notre Dame in, and they lost to Northern Illinois.
Yeah, because you also have to remember that we're projecting out.
Yeah.
So I think that Notre Dame's likelihood of running the table, and by the way, looks better and better every week, is probably higher than an LSU or an Alabama or a Tennessee, because these teams all have to play each other. Now, Notre Dame has Navy, and they have
a tricky.
They have USC.
I think the next 2 weeks are very tricky for Notre Dame. I think going to play Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Now, it's not at Georgia Tech. It's at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, so you're probably talking about a 50-50 crowd split. But I think Georgia Tech is a type of team that's going to give Notre Dame some trouble. And then you've got Navy at MetLife Stadium. So the Navy game is the one that everybody's pointing to, but don't be shocked if the Georgia Tech game is the tricky one too.
Yeah, well, Georgia Tech has proven on multiple occasions this year that it's a pretty spunky team.
That
can spring up on you. Now, obviously, the Florida State situation isn't the same as we thought it was the day it happened, but they're a functional team, and Haynes King is a fun player.
Duke was undefeated, and Georgia Tech goes in there and beats them.
Yeah, if you look up at the scoreboard on Saturday and you see that Georgia Tech is beating Notre Dame by 3 with 10 minutes left in the third quarter, like, that's not a surprising thing to see. So
they should have, they had to eke one out against North Carolina, but still, they are frisky. And I would be worried about them if I were Notre Dame. I'd be worried about Navy if I were Notre Dame. I'd still be worried about Army if I were Notre Dame. So we'll see what happens.
Well, let me drag you into a bit of Big 12 hell.
Yeah, let's go.
Because
we're getting our Big 12 plus 3.5 minus 3.5 coin minted, so we can pick Big 12 games from here on out.
Listen, man. What are there, 5 that are still in the picture, and 5 that could
let us count the ways. So BYU and Iowa State are still undefeated and do not play one another. So they could be on a collision course. K-State has 1 loss.
Mm-hmm.
West Virginia has 1 conference loss. That was to Iowa State.
Yep. We have Texas Tech in the mix.
Texas Tech is undefeated in conference play. We'll have to play Iowa State on November 2nd.
Yeah, so I think that's 5 teams.
Yeah.
And Colorado still only has 1 loss.
They only have 1 conference loss.
So, you have half the conference still alive. Now, we think that Iowa State and BYU are probably the 2 right now that are standing above the others, because they are unbeaten. I think BYU's resume is, sneaky, really good. That
the SMU win,
is starting to, show a little bit now. SMU was a little bit weird in the beginning of the year, but they still beat them. Their schedules also line up pretty nicely. So right now, those 2, but when you're thinking about who's going to make it, is there any thought process to you that it's possible that there are 2 Big 12 teams in the field? Did you even consider that as
it's possible. And here's the scenario I think where that works. If Iowa State and BYU, well, obviously if they're both undefeated entering
that's the
Big 12 championship, they're both getting it. That I don't even think we have to talk about that. I think the more interesting one is if somebody's 11-1 and the other one's 12-0, and the 11-1 team beats the 12-0 team in the championship, I still think they would both get in.
Yeah.
In that scenario.
Yeah. So I had, not that we're not talking about me right now, but I had 2 in the field, and I had a hard time with that, because I think that was a result of me not wanting to choose between BYU and Iowa State.
Right. And
because it's an impossible thing to do.
We'll get the game if this keeps up. That's the beauty of this. We will get that game if this keeps up. And I know you look at these schedules and these giant conferences and all these weird tiebreakers. That would actually be a very elegant way to do it if they don't play each other and they're both undefeated. But if you want to kind of handicap it, the rest of Iowa State's road is harder than the rest of BYU's road. Iowa State has to play Texas Tech. Iowa State still has to play Kansas State. BYU has a remaining schedule that, if we looked at the beginning of the year, we'd say, oh man, that's rough.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at it now, maybe not so much. Oklahoma State, we know what's going on there, but they're also always good for some weird, wacky surprise.
Yeah, Oklahoma State's the type of team that's going to just jump out and beat one.
One of these, yeah. At UCF, the at Utah game is the one, because it is a massive rivalry, these two schools hate each other so much. These programs hate each other so much. Anything can happen in that game. But if you look at what's happened to Utah over the last few weeks, I mean, BYU looks like a much better team right now.
Especially if Cam Rising that's not rust. It's just like the accumulation of a bunch of injuries and a lot of missed time. He didn't look very good on Friday night. So yeah, I think that the thing with the Big 12 is that when you look at the schedule on the surface, BYU should probably win each and every game that they play individually. But I keep saying winning all of them
is
harder than winning one.
Yep.
And that's it. But like there's 5 or 6 teams in the Big 12 that are still alive. The Big 10 too has Penn State that's unbeaten, Indiana, which is unbeaten, and then of course we had the Titan matchup on Saturday night that came down to a 1-point situation between Ohio State and Oregon. So you've got 4 Big 10 teams here that are still firmly in the mix. And, I think now that USC is unfortunately, and I say that with purpose, not in the playoff race, and it looks like Michigan's probably done. Like those would be the 4 teams right now. Am I forgetting somebody?
I mean, you could throw Illinois in there. You could throw Nebraska in there, depending on how things go. But we'll find. I mean, Illinois needed overtime to beat Purdue.
Yeah.
So I don't think they're going to be there, but there's some games. Illinois is playing Michigan this week. Like they could beat Michigan. We'll see. But Nebraska, Indiana.
Yeah.
Like they could be
but
both one-loss teams at the end of that.
The Big 10 and the SEC had a chance for both teams to send 4 teams to
the
playoff, and it doesn't look like it's working out that way. If Ohio State were to drop a game to Penn State, that's when things would get really interesting, because then you would have to wonder if Ohio State could still get in. Penn State would probably be in pole position with Oregon.
Right.
Both of those teams would both get in because they have that win over Ohio State. And then what do you do with Indiana? Like,
right. Let's not forget it if Indiana keeps winning. Now, Nebraska is going to be a really interesting game this week. If Indiana gets past that, I think Indiana can beat Michigan. The Indiana-Ohio State might actually be one of the more exciting games in the Big Ten this year. Which,
say it again.
Indiana-Ohio State might actually be one of the most exciting games in the Big Ten this year. Wild to think about, but
yeah,
it is amazing.
Let's check in on the ACC, Andy.
Okay, let's do it.
This is bracketology. This is all. Okay, so we just assume that Clemson and Miami are the 2 that are going to represent that conference.
We do.
We assume that.
And we feel pretty good about that, except Pitt is undefeated.
Yeah.
Now, Pitt has to play Clemson down the stretch. And let's not forget SMU.
No.
Whose only loss is to BYU, which is non-conference. This is going to be a little more interesting than maybe we thought.
Yeah. So there's a lot of pretty pivotal games coming up here in these races, and a lot of teams that are still in the mix. Between your bracketology and my bubble watch, I think we probably have like 24 to 25 total teams that are still alive in making the playoff. And these games are going to go a long way in helping determine those things. So, in Colorado too, I wanted to say, I looked down. We didn't really talk about that much in the Big 12 stuff, but it really does stink that Travis Hunter was in there, because I think they would have had a chance to remain unbeaten had he not come out of that game. So
in conference.
Yeah. So yeah, we're gearing up. Like, it feels like this season is flowing by faster than any college football season I've ever covered. But at the same time, it's so exciting to know that all the excitement is still ahead.
Well, and we're getting to those meaningful, impactful games that we talked about. When we would always argue about what the 12-team playoff was going to do in terms of meaning and impact. And I always said it would blunt the impact of some of the huge games among the Titans at the top, but it would create a lot more games that matter
basically
among other teams.
You're trading the impact blow of
for
the
volume.
Ohio State-Oregon game for the volume of games that are going to be like SMU and Pitt in a few weeks.
Correct. And the volume's coming. And I think we saw it last night. I think we saw it in Baton Rouge with Ole Miss and LSU. Because again, Ole Miss is not eliminated from the playoff, but it feels like they are right now.
Yeah, right. Anytime you're kind of in a win out or go home scenario at this point in the season with the schedule that's still ahead of them, that it feels that way.
And it could feel that way again in Knoxville next weekend, which, listen, you saw what happened at the end of that game the last time it was in Knoxville.
Yeah.
This could be even wilder with even bigger stakes. We'll find out.